Just days after U.S. forces began wading ashore in Okinawa, the Japanese unleashed its newly formed Special Attack Corps, the Kamikaze Tokotai, against the immense American fleet covering the landing. Hundreds of pilots who had taken a vow to crash their aircraft into an enemy ship took off in search of the American fleet. The U.S. Navy was ready and waiting, and patrolling fighters or anti-aircraft guns shot down most kamikazes before they ever reached Okinawa. But dozens survived long enough to mount an attack on an American ship.
And I look up and it's a Japanese kamikaze. And I'm realizing this fool's getting ready to come down either my stack or that guy over there in that other vessel. So I watch him to see where he was going. And fortunately for me, he did in fact go down the stack of that other ship.
The most sought-after targets were the carriers and battleships, but on this day at least, none were damaged. The brunt of the attacks fell instead on the outer picket forces, made up of destroyers, minesweepers, and light cruisers.
Within about 10 minutes' time, we had 3 planes diving at us, and every one of them missed us. They missed us close enough that when their bombs exploded, it tore some holes in our ship. It wasn't anything serious. It didn't affect our ship that much. We were able to patch that up and be on our way again.
By day's end, 3 picket destroyers had been sunk and numerous other vessels put out of action. The kamikazes that actually made it through to Okinawa destroyed an LST and 2 vital ammunition ships. American defenders were stunned by the tenacity displayed by the Japanese pilots. But for the men of the 5th Fleet covering the landing at Okinawa, their ordeal was just beginning. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in May 1944 had been an overwhelming victory for American aviators. Over the course of 2 days, the air arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 3 more carriers and most of what remained of their trained air crews. After the battle, many Japanese leaders began to doubt that traditional tactics alone could stop the Americans. In fact, by this point in the war, the Imperial Navy had already developed 3 suicide weapons. The Kai-10, a small submarine that was essentially a human-guided torpedo. The Oka, a rocket-powered glide bomb called Baka by the Allies that was intended to be dropped from a bomber and flown into the target by its pilot. And the Shinyo, a small speedboat driven by 1 man and loaded with explosives. All 3 weapons proved to be at least moderately effective, but it was the Army Air Force that came up with the idea seized upon by the Japanese command.
Something that is not as well known in the West is the fact that it wasn't the Japanese Navy that launched the initial suicide attacks. It was actually the Japanese Army Air Force. Using some Ki-45 NIC fighters, twin-engine fighters known as Toryu fighters, they launched a suicide attack against the American fleet off of Biak in May of 1944. And this first attack actually points the way to a whole new tactical development on the part of the Japanese and would lead to the Toko Corps, the kamikazes, later on in 1944.
By organizing the Kamikaze Tokotai, the Japanese sought to attack the Americans psychologically and make them lose their will to continue the war. The proposal was quickly adopted, and in the Philippines, the Special Attack Corps was hastily organized, even as more conventional defense plans were taking shape. After the fall of the Marianas, the Japanese conceived Operation Shogo, a plan for the strategic defense of the Japanese home islands that addressed an attack on the Philippines, Formosa, the Kuriil Islands, or the Ryukyus. The first and most likely American objective, the Philippine Islands, was given the designation Shogo 1. Operation Show 1 was a complex three-pronged strategy that used the remaining Japanese carriers as bait to lure away American forces covering a landing in the southern Philippines. This would allow two other surface forces to advance on Leyte from the west with the threat of air attack greatly reduced. The center force would pass through San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea, while the southern force would strike via Surigao Strait, catching the landing force in a massive double envelopment. Typical of Japanese attack plans in that it relied on division of forces and deception, the operation required better timing and communications than the Imperial fleet was capable of. But as Admiral Kurita remarked just prior to his departure on the mission, there are such things as miracles. In preparation for the coming assault, the Japanese Army and Navy had already based several thousand planes throughout the Philippines, but finding men capable of flying them was another matter.
The Japanese had oriented their aircrew training towards one objective, and that was creating a very small elite cadre of highly trained personnel who could inflict tremendous offensive damage on a foe. Well, this was a very, very sharp blade, but it was also very thin, because once these original pilots were lost in the battles in 1942 and 43, there was nothing coming from the training commands back in Japan to replace these guys. The pilots that were being thrown into those fights, especially in the Solomons in 1943, were much lesser experienced. They didn't have the training that the earlier cadres did. And because the Zero was so easily destroyed in air-to-air combat, these new Japanese pilots didn't have the chance to come up their learning curve in combat and become experienced fighter pilots. And while they did expand their training regimen and training program, they were unable to produce the quality of pilots necessary to hold the line against the swelling strength of the American air services.
As the invasion date for the Leyte landings neared, Task Force 38 focused its attention on airfields within range of the southern Philippines. Beginning on October 10th, naval aviators pummeled bases on Okinawa, Luzon, and Formosa, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground and causing massive destruction. The Japanese tentatively struck back at the American fleet, but when wildly exaggerated reports claimed that 2 battleships and 11 carriers had been sunk and many more damaged, the decision was made to put the air component of Shogo 2 into action. On October 12th, hundreds of Japanese pilots, including those from the carrier air groups who were just then completing their training, were committed to an all-out assault on the American fleet. The decisive blow was finally at hand, but as had happened at critical junctures before, it was the Americans who would deliver it. Task Group 38's fighters and anti-aircraft fire inflicted terrible losses on the Japanese. Over the course of 3 days, the Americans downed an estimated 600 planes, including hundreds flown by Japan's newly trained carrier pilots. The Japanese had squandered virtually the last of their naval aviators in exchange for 2 damaged cruisers and fewer than 100 enemy aircraft. On October 20th, 1944, a massive amphibious assault supported by 500 ships and mounted by 200,000 men of the U.S. Sixth Army invaded the island of Leyte. Opposition to the landings was unexpectedly light, and by early afternoon, General MacArthur had waded ashore to dramatize his promised return to the Philippines for newsreel cameras. Supporting the effort was the U.S. 3rd and 7th Fleets, commanded by Admirals Halsey and Kincaid, respectively. The 3rd Fleet was acting the role of roving watchdog, while the 7th Fleet was tasked with providing support for the landing forces. As with any divided command, there was the potential for poor coordination.
When Halsey went out to take over 5th Fleet, turn it to 3rd Fleet, he went with a specific set of orders that he and Nimitz had worked out in the case that the Japanese fleet came out, either en masse or divided, as it turned out it did come out, of dealing with that fleet, because Halsey felt from the very beginning his first mission with the fast carriers was to sink Japanese ships. It was not to cover the landings. That was Kincaid's job, and he had 3 taffies to do it with. And as far as Halsey was concerned, that was enough to do the job. His job was to go find the Japanese if they sortied and sink them.
Halsey would not have long to wait, for by the evening of the 22nd, all 3 elements of the Japanese attack plan had sailed.
The Japanese decided they would stake all once the Americans invaded the Philippines. So it was here they were going to try to fight their last-ditch decisive battle. And the only remaining assets the Japanese Navy had left were its huge battleships. What they wanted to do was get those fleet assets, get those battleships in amongst the American transports, and destroy the American fleet invading Leyte Island. Well, the only way that was going to be successful was if the American carriers weren't in the area and had been diverted or distracted away from the Leyte landing sites. There weren't any planes hardly left to the Japanese carriers at this point, so the flat tops themselves were useless assets. So what they decided to do was use the remaining fleet carriers as bait to draw the American aircraft carrier forces away from Leyte and give the Japanese battleships a chance to get in amongst the transports.
The Japanese center force, which included the battleships Musashi and Yamato, sortied from Brunei on October 22nd and set a course for the Sibuyan Sea, where on the morning of the 24th, it was detected and attacked by Halsey's 3rd Fleet. Dodging the pink and purple bursts of anti-aircraft fire, American Helldivers and Avengers pressed one attack after another.
When we had dive bombers going in or torpedo bombers, we always had a group of fighters that went in ahead of them. The reason why is so that we could use our guns to try to get the gunners out of their gun sponsons and give the bombers behind us a chance to really get set for dropping their bombs.
At the cost of 18 aircraft, the Americans sank Musashi and badly damaged the heavy cruiser Miyoko, while inflicting enough damage on the remaining ships that Kurita reversed course at 1550 hours to escape the onslaught. But just as Japanese aviators had done just days before off Formosa, American pilots greatly overestimated the number of ships they had sunk, which led Admiral Halsey to conclude that Kurita's center force could no longer be considered a serious menace. When Admiral Ozawa's carriers were spotted cruising east of Luzon at 1640, Halsey considered his options, then fired off a message to Nimitz. With 5 heavy and 5 light fleet carriers, 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and more than 40 destroyers between them, the American task groups greatly outnumbered the Japanese northern force. Halsey would at last have his battle of annihilation, but his decision to pursue Ozawa with all of his available fleet assets left the exit of San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded and led to one of the hottest controversies of World War II.
Once the Americans located Kurita's center force, Halsey prepared to deal with it by establishing a Task Force 34 to contain all 6 of his fast battleships along with cruisers and destroyers, and they would block the San Bernardino Strait. But when American airstrikes turned Kurita back and sank the Musashi, Halsey didn't see any point in detaching the task force, so he kept the battleships with him when he took off to the northeast after Ozawa. But unfortunately, he didn't notify Nimitz or Kincaid that he was doing so, and the San Bernardino Strait was left open.
I personally don't think Halsey did anything wrong. I don't think it was his job to cover San Bernardino Strait. I think that was Kincaid's job to, if nothing else, put a couple of pickets up there. It's not like it was a long ways away. And, you know, if he'd had put a couple of picket destroyers off the mouth of San Bernardino Strait and said, if something comes through, give us a word, he'd have had 5 hours to arrange his fleet. And he had a big fleet.
The battle group assigned to 7th Fleet and under the command of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf included 6 battleships, 9 cruisers, 29 destroyers, and 39 torpedo boats. Thanks to air reconnaissance, this powerful force was positioned not at San Bernardino Strait, but at the exit of Surigao Strait, awaiting the arrival of the Japanese Southern Force. Early on the morning of October 25th, the ambush was sprung. PT boats attacked relentlessly for almost 4 hours before American destroyers descended on the Japanese. In a series of well-executed torpedo attacks, the Japanese Southern Force was reduced to but 3 battle-worthy ships. Those that remained stood boldly on, only to be buried by an avalanche of radar-directed fire from the American battle line. Full salvos of 14 and 16-inch armor-piercing shells from West Virginia, Tennessee, and California, together with more than 4,000 rounds of 5 and 8-inch fire from the cruisers, claimed the battleship Yamashiro and badly damaged the cruiser Mogami. The Battle of Surigao Strait was a rout and cost the Japanese 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 3 destroyers in exchange for 1 American PT boat. The Southern Pincer was crushed in the last naval battle in history fought between battleships. Oldendorf's cruisers had yet to finish off the last Japanese cripples when alarming news was received from the north. The escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy III were running for their lives, pursued by Kurita's battleships and cruisers. At dawn on October 25th, the 7th Fleet's escort carrier units were operating off the east coast of Samar. Sometime after 0600, the carriers began launching patrols of FM-2 Wildcats to provide cover for the escort groups and the ships in Leyte Gulf, as well as Avengers loaded with depth charges to search for Japanese submarines. It was all part of the morning routine. Any threat from the Japanese Southern Force had been eliminated by Oldendorf's battle group during the night, and Halsey's powerful 3rd Fleet effectively blocked the Japanese Central and Northern forces, or so Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague and the men of Taffy III believed. But at 0645, things began to get interesting. Anti-aircraft fire was observed to the northwest, followed in rapid succession by an unexpected surface radar contact and a report from a reconnaissance flight that indicated a powerful Japanese surface force was but 20 miles north and closing rapidly. When lookouts detected the unmistakable masts of Japanese battleships and cruisers appearing above the northern horizon, the surprise was complete. It was Vice Admiral Kurita's center force. 4 battle wagons, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers had completed their transit of San Bernardino in the dark. Sprague, with 6 escort carriers and 7 support ships, did the only thing he could. Turned away, made smoke, launched aircraft, and called for help.
This Japanese battle fleet comes down through those back islands and catches these little jeep carriers in there, and heck, they haven't got the speed or the armament. The only armament they have is what few little airplanes they have on them,
Here we were with 12 FM-2s and 8 or TBMs, and these little jeeps at top speed with about 17 knots, facing the Japanese battleship with 18-inch guns on her, and huge battle fleet they had.
Wildcats and Avengers swarmed over the Japanese fleet, armed with weapons intended for ground support or anti-submarine patrols and wholly unsuited for use against large warships. The air attacks caused no significant damage, but they helped throw the Japanese battle formation into chaos.
We started making strafing runs on anything we could see, and there was plenty to shoot at. Battleships, cruisers, destroyer, and we expended all our ammunition in about 4 or 5 runs, and then we stayed out there and just started making dummy runs just to harass them, nothing else, just let them know we were still around.
The air attacks, supplemented now by air groups from Taffy II, forced the Japanese to take evasive maneuvers and helped attract fire away from the destroyers and destroyer escorts, which were attacking with reckless abandon. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, Hull, Heermann and Johnston, joined by the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, courageously took on Kurita's battleships and cruisers with torpedoes and their 5-inch guns.
And I saw those 8-inch turrets turning toward us. They're about 10,000 yards by then, but you could see it. They're big ships. And I saw those cruisers take aim at right here in between my eyes. And we heard the noise and the smoke. And the shells came right over our heads. You can actually see the shells. They couldn't get their guns low enough to get us. We were so small. Copeland went in at 4,900 yards, turned, and we fired our 3 fish. And one of them blew his stern off of that cruiser. And we were just young enough to yelling, "Hey, you hit him, Whitey," and meaning our torpedo guys. It was like rooting for, we were rooting like it was a ball game. Made that turn, we started out, and we ran into a rain squall. We come out of the rain squall, and here comes the USS Hull, one of our destroyers, coming right by. We almost collided, and they already took about 7 hits. And when I tell you, I could see that there was no bridge left, their mast was down, the funnel was gone, and that's when we knew, boy, this is for real, that we were in a fight to the finish.
In one of the great examples of sheer guts in naval history, the outgunned Americans fought so tenaciously that the Japanese surface fleet, fearing the arrival of more powerful U.S. forces, finally gave up and turned away. But not before they had sunk Gambier Bay and 3 of her screen, USS Hull, Johnston, and the Samuel B. Roberts. While Taffy 3 was fighting Kurita's ships, to the south, Taffy 1 was being subjected to the first organized kamikaze attack of the war.
All morning long, Kurita, as his battleships engaged the American escort carriers, kept calling for air support, and he received none. After he turned away, and after this naval engagement, the surface engagement ended, the first kamikazes showed up in support of Kurita, although he'd already left. And they attacked the remaining escort carriers and hit several of them, causing extensive damage.
USS Santee and Sewanee were both rocked by direct hits that caused considerable damage and claimed numerous lives. But excellent damage control efforts saved both ships. Taffy 3's turn came just an hour after their surface battle with Kurita had ended. The Americans, weakened by combat losses in the earlier engagement, were unable to put up much in the way of defense. Of the remaining CVEs, only Fanshawe Bay emerged unscathed. White Plains escaped serious damage when anti-aircraft fire claimed an attacker mere yards from her stern, but the resulting explosions scattered debris that caused several minor casualties. Kitkun Bay narrowly avoided an attack by a Mitsubishi Betty, but 1 man was killed and 16 wounded when a Zero struck. 4 planes attacked Kalinin Bay, and while intense anti-aircraft fire splashed 2 close aboard, the 3rd caused serious damage to the port side of the flight deck, and the 4th destroyed the aft stack. San Lo was even less fortunate. Struck by a single kamikaze that crashed through her flight deck, she was engulfed in a huge ball of flame. Powerful internal explosions followed, and about 15 minutes later, San Lo slipped beneath the waves and disappeared. 5 gallant ships and over 1,000 sailors and airmen were lost during the battle off Samar. But the Taffys turned back the Japanese and saved General MacArthur's beachhead on Leyte. By 0700, on October 25th, about the same time the first salvos from Kurita's battleships started dropping amongst the escort carriers of Taffy 3, Halsey's 3rd Fleet had closed to within 150 miles of Ozawa. The disparity in the strength contained in the opposing forces bordered on the absurd. 6 Japanese carriers, all but devoid of aircraft and screened by 2 antiquated battleships, 3 cruisers and 10 destroyers, faced 5 Essex-class and an equal number of Independence-class carriers that were screened by 6 battleships and a host of cruisers and destroyers. The Americans could put more than 600 planes in the air, and by first light, 180 were orbiting above the fleet, waiting word on the Northern Force's location. At 0710, just as appeals for help from 7th Fleet began to ring in, search aircraft made contact with Ozawa's carriers, 145 miles distant. At 0830, a minute after Kincaid reported that his situation was critical, Mitcher's first strike fell on Ozawa's ships. Airstrikes continued until evening, by which time American aircraft had flown 527 sorties against the Northern Force, sinking Zuikaku, Zuiho, and Chiyoda, and the destroyer Akitsuki. Carrier Chitose was disabled, as was the cruiser Tama. The Northern Force had been all but eliminated, but another prize escaped the American Third Fleet.
It's customary when sending military messages to add nonsense words as padding to make it harder for the enemy to decode the message. By sheer bad luck, when Nimitz ordered Halsey to turn his battleships back to Kincaid's assistance, the message ended with the nonsense phrase, "The world wonders." Halsey, for some reason, read that as part of the real message and took it as a personal insult. He had a fit. And it was hours before he issued the order for his battleships to turn around to intercept Kurita. By that time, it was too late.
The fact that they faulted Halsey for not separating his big gunships and stationing them there, I think that's Monday morning quarterbacking. He wanted those ships to sink Ozawa's ships. And those guys wanted to so bad they could taste it. You mentioned a while ago Ching Lee. My God, he had him where he could probably see the smoke on the horizon and had to turn around. This from an admiral who had spent a lifetime for this one opportunity. I think there are people who do not want to fault Nimitz or do not want to fault MacArthur because they insisted on keeping that theater divided in command, and Roosevelt would not subjugate one to the other. And Leyte Gulf is what you got out of it.
Even allowing for the fateful results of Halsey falling for Ozawa's decoy, the 3 days of Leyte Gulf achieved a decisive victory for the United States Navy.
The disrupted Japanese turned and headed away from the Philippines, and the few remaining ships they had left to them were quickly deactivated, and the Japanese fleet as a military entity really ceased to exist.
With the Japanese surface fleet in tatters, kamikaze attacks began to grow in both frequency and intensity. On October 30th, 158 men died and 45 aircraft were destroyed when USS Franklin and Belleau Wood were struck. Prompt fire and damage control limited the effects, but both carriers were forced to withdraw for repairs. More attacks off Leyte soon followed.
I was up on the flight deck the day we got the kamikaze hit, and I could see these two planes coming in, and our gunners finally shot one down, just disintegrated. But the other guy kept coming, and here I was standing up there gawking, and I finally realized, I mean, he's going to hit. So I took off for the hangar deck, and about the time I got about halfway down, why he hit in the island structure and did a lot of damage. I don't know, there was maybe 100 and some odd people got killed, and several burned badly and wounded badly, but it was pretty tough. It strained the resources on board ship to take care of all the wounded and the dead and clean up. We didn't cease operations except for just a few hours. You know, we were operational again the next day.
As the Philippines campaign wore on, the Japanese scored some deadly successes with their kamikazes.
There were about 50 Japanese planes that came over the hills from the west of Leyte, and the Japanese started down toward the shipping area, and the Navy then latched onto them, I say the Navy fighter pilots, and I had a spectacular view of aerial combat there in the fact that I saw 5 Japanese planes going down in flame at one time, and really there was only one plane, Japanese plane, that got out over the shipping area, and by the time he got there, he was smoking and flaming, and he kamikazed into the ship right behind us and crashed and burned. And I do not know whether that ship sunk or not, but it took a lot of damage.
But everybody was shooting out there, and that could make you nervous because you get shrapnel falling on the deck like rain. Some of those guys would shoot at a plane and follow it down, and then bullets would be zipping over your head. That got interesting.
Though carriers and battleships always drew the most attention, no ship, regardless of size, was immune from attack.
They had 2 try to hit our tender, and I was on there trying to change an engine on a boat alongside of it. And this plane come down, and 5 inch on the tender was going, and the machine guns and everything shooting, and this plane came down, and it missed us, and it came down right alongside of the PT boat. His wing clipped the crane we was working with, and he crashed outside. There was a big explosion and cloud of smoke. And then another one crashed astern. They had a suicide plane. Both of them missed the tender. If they had hit it, well, I guess I wouldn't be here now.
These new Japanese attacks shocked the Americans, who sought ways to counter this new threat, and the U.S. Navy worked quickly to beef up its fleet defenses. First, more anti-aircraft guns were mounted on every ship, from the lowliest landing craft to the mightiest battleship. But in most cases, these light cannon and machine guns could serve only as last-ditch point defense weapons. The Navy needed a way to keep the kamikazes from ever getting to their targets in the first place. What the fleet needed were more fighters. To make that happen, the carrier air groups were reorganized in the late fall of 1944. The bomber squadrons were reduced in size, while the number of fighters was almost doubled.
Because of all the kamikazes, they had displaced a lot of the torpedo planes and bombers and made 72 plane fighter squadrons. There was about half the planes on board ship were going to be fighters. So we had a 72 plane squadron and 102 or 3 pilots.
By late in the war, squadrons of SB-2Cs and of TBM Avengers had dwindled to barely 12 to 15 aircraft in some instances because of the kamikaze threat and because of the Hellcat being able to do so much as far as not only air-to-air but air-to-ground. They bulked up the number of fighters.
With the need for more fighters to combat the kamikazes so severe, the Navy grabbed Marine Corsair squadrons and assigned them to shipboard duty.
Corsairs were initially introduced to combat in the Solomon Islands on land. They did not fly from carriers initially and operated with the Marine Corps and also one famous Navy squadron, the Jolly Rogers of Fighting Squadron 17. Later in the war, the aircraft did make it aboard carrier decks. And really it did that because they needed extra fighters on board that could handle the kamikazes and combat the kamikazes.
The hope was that with increased combat air patrols, more fighters available for intercept missions, and more fighter pilots available, the Navy could throw a big blue blanket over its fleet, protecting the precious ships below from further attacks.
The whole concept behind the big blue blanket was the Navy wanted the ability to keep enough fighters up over the fleet to be able to handle any incoming attacks. Kamikaze or conventional attacks didn't matter. They wanted hundreds of fighters to be available to protect the fleet from these new Japanese threats.
In late January 1945, with its contribution to the Philippines campaign complete, 3rd Fleet returned to Ulithi to rest and replenish before undertaking the next campaign. Halsey turned over command to Spruance, who had been ashore since August planning the conquest of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and with the change, 3rd Fleet again became 5th Fleet. On February 11th, TF-58 weighed anchor and set a course to the northeast. Passing east of Guam, the force slowed near Tinian on February 12th to rehearse the upcoming Iwo Jima landings with the 3rd Marine Division, and then assumed a more northerly heading, which it maintained until 1900 hours on the 15th. The fleet then abruptly changed course to the northwest, and over the next 2 days, TF-58 sent hundreds of planes against Tokyo and the Japanese home islands. The attacks, the first launch from carriers since the Doolittle raid nearly 3 years earlier, sought to draw Japan's attention away from the impending assault on Iwo Jima and to hinder Japan's ability to throw air attacks against the landing forces.
We all took off and rendezvoused together, and I don't know who was leading this flight, but it was a tremendous flight. As we approached the Japanese coast, you could see it there, and the leader decided we needed more altitude, so we made a great big circle around, climbing all the way, and we were down towards the back end of this bunch, and I didn't realize how many airplanes we had in the air until they got in this big circle and you could see them all. And I estimate we had about 1,000 airplanes on that raid.
As we were passing over this peninsula south of Tokyo, I saw this airfield there and airplanes taking off, and whether it was right, wrong, or indifferent, I took, I guess it was 12 of our airplanes, but anyway, part of the combat air patrol covering the strike group and made this strike there. And again, fortunately, it turned out all right. I got Soshi Sugita, and we were able to eventually join back up, and they never were intercepted before they reached their strike. But it was close. In other words, I thought, boy, I was blessed then. If they had been hit by a strike, it would have been pretty sad for me to have been off strafing the ground and shooting down a couple of airplanes taking off.
This first Tokyo strike really sets the stage for how the American carriers will conduct operations against the Japanese in the final months of the war. Time after time in 1943 and 44, you see the carriers striking isolated Japanese bases in the Central Pacific. Not anymore. Now they're at the enemy's front door. And through the rest of the war, time after time, they're going to be turning north, away from Okinawa, away from Iwo Jima during those campaigns to suppress Japanese airfields and hit strategic targets in the imperial homeland itself.
On February 16, 1945, D-3, the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of Task Force 54 commenced the pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima.
The island was pummeled and pummeled and pummeled. And as good as the Navy had gotten at taking island defenses apart earlier in the war, this place was something else. It was impenetrable. The Japanese could just sit back in their caves and take it and take it and take it. And there were the kinds of troops who were stoic enough to take it with good weapons, sophisticated bunkers and caves and hideouts and so forth, good fields of fire, and a lot of stuff going for them, obvious landing beaches. And it was very easy to sight guns, hidden guns, guns in caves and bunkers and so forth, high up, overlooking the beach. The Japanese totally dominated the beaches. And the only way Marines were going to save themselves was to get up there and take those positions away, one body at a time.
As Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions battled for every foot against determined resistance, direct air support was provided by escort carriers of Task Force 52.2, operating northeast of Iwo, which allowed the fast carriers to rove as needed. Whether providing CAP for the amphibious forces and our own screen, supporting the men on the ground, or performing strikes on Japanese airfields that posed a threat to the invasion force, Task Force 58 operated like a well-oiled machine. Between D-Day and the time Iwo was declared secure more than 4 weeks later, The American task groups standing offshore were subjected to numerous kamikaze attacks. The largest and most damaging occurred on the 21st, when 32 aircraft broke through the radar picket screen and CAP to score numerous hits, sinking the escort carrier Bismarck C and seriously damaging Saratoga and 4 other ships. Elements of Task Force 58 remained on station near Iwo until March 9th, when Army fighters and bombers operating from the island's captured airfields formally took over CAP duties. By the 12th, all carriers of Task Force 58 had returned to Ulithi, but the break in operations was brief. At 0600 on the 14th, Task Group 58.4, with Enterprise, Yorktown, and Intrepid, set sail for the southernmost home island of Kyushu, determined to suppress the formidable kamikaze threat based there. The importance of the mission was underlined just days before, when an attack on the fleet anchorage at Ulithi did considerable damage to USS Randolph.
It was just about dark, just dusk, and all of a sudden there was this incredible explosion, and I came up on the flight deck, and the whole aft end of the ship back there was nothing but flames and black smoke. The flight deck was all ruptured and pushed up. Then I went on down to the hangar deck, and the whole aft end of the hangar deck was still burning, and there were several casualties, so it was pretty gruesome. But anyway, I went up on the forecastle, the front end of the ship, to get as far away from the fire and stuff as possible. But the ship's damage control people had the fire out in less than a half an hour.
A week later, while the Fifth Fleet concentrated its attacks on the Japanese naval bases at Kobe and Kure, Wasp was damaged and Franklin was nearly sunk when a Japanese Judy dive bomber managed to place 2 bombs on her deck just as a full air group strike was being launched.
The Franklin went into just one big black cloud of smoke, and, you know, it made you say, okay, there goes one of our carriers. And a minute or so later, here she comes, steaming right out of it, and still underway, and people on the flight deck already hoses out fighting this thing.
In a testament to the survivability of Essex-class carriers, Franklin somehow survived, but over 800 of her crew perished in the inferno. On April 1st, more than 60,000 infantrymen and Marines landed unopposed on Okinawa. The Japanese chose not to defend the beaches in favor of a strategy that emphasized defense in depth, allowing the 100,000-man-strong Japanese 32nd Army to fight a protracted battle that would put both the attacking amphibious forces and naval armada at risk.
Okinawa was the ultimate strategic battle of the Pacific War. As important as the Marianas were, this is a strategic battle for the base from which Japan was going to be taken down. There are no illusions about that.
In preparation for a last-ditch defense of the home islands, the Japanese had reserved the bulk of their kamikaze force at bases on Kyushu and Formosa. During the early months of 1945, the Special Attack Corps had greatly expanded as thousands of pilots either volunteered or were conscripted into service. Although some units included experienced flyers, the average kamikaze pilot received little in the way of training.
You didn't have to be an excellent flyer to be a kamikaze pilot. All you had to do was fly the thing into a fixed target. And that's what did us in the kamikaze attacks.
The full weight of the Special Attack Corps was finally unleashed against the American fleet in April 1945, just days after Army and Marine forces landed at Okinawa, in what the Japanese called kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum attacks. Waves of kamikazes took off in search of the American carriers.
The Japanese air raids really didn't start in earnest until about 5 days before the invasion of Okinawa. And we'd been there a couple of days and saw sporadic air action from the Japanese, but on the 26th and 27th of March there was some big raids and a lot of damaged ships from mainly kamikaze planes. And then on the 28th and 29th, our ship shot down 6 kamikaze planes and 2 fighter planes, 2 attack bombers, and 1 twin-engine bomber.
Dozens of ships took hits, despite the huge numbers of American fighters patrolling over the fleet.
Kamikazes were usually in such small groups that they didn't show up on the ship's radar till the last minute, which really meant, though, if you were on combat air patrol, then you got sort of a last-minute vector to intercept the incoming raid.
I don't remember any different mindset. You know, a Japanese plane was a Japanese plane, and we tried to get them all. And it doesn't happen the way you think. Well, it may with some fighter aces, but I got so excited. You're supposed to go in and they tell you, you shoot a little burst of ammunition and then you change your aim to correct it, and you have some tracers going out there so you can correct the aim, and then you correct your aim and shoot another burst. Listen, I was there like I had a garden hose. Man, I had my finger on that trigger and I wasn't going to let him go.
And when you'd hit them, they would just explode all over the place because they had all this TNT in them.
Though the Combat Air Patrol shot down countless would-be kamikazes, hundreds managed to survive long enough to mount an attack on an enemy vessel. Especially hard hit were the picket destroyers sent north of Okinawa to act as early warning radar ships. They attracted kamikazes almost every day, making their duty one of the most dangerous in U.S. Navy history.
Picket stations were ordinarily manned by a destroyer or 2 destroyers and several LCI types. There was another version of the LCI called the LCS, which was built from the beginning as a fire support vessel. You didn't have to convert troop compartments to magazines or that sort of thing because they were made for this purpose in the beginning. And they had 3 dual 40s, which made it quite an effective anti-aircraft platform for a small vessel. And they would assign 3 or 4 of those, or LCIGs or Ms, with the destroyers out on those stations. And the suicide planes would always go for the destroyers because they go for the bigger ships.
About 3 months, almost 4 months of real hell. I might say hell, because you never knew these planes were coming in. They were coming in by the dozens, you know.
If they come straight at you, they're not hard to shoot down. You know, you have time to line up on them and they're coming in like a duck coming right in at you. But if they're going sideways or across, you have to lead them like leading a duck, and that's not as easy. Well, this Betty we shot down, but it had released what they call a Baka bomb, a winged bomb with a pilot inside that had rocket propulsion as well. And this thing came shooting down at us, and we didn't know what it was. And we managed to shoot it down at the last minute. It landed about 70 yards from us. And then another Betty released another Baka bomb. And this one came down, and we had time to line up both 5-inch guns and 40 millimeters, and we were shooting at this thing, and shot the wings off, and then the fuselage, where the pilot was, the warhead in the nose separated from the rest of the fuselage, And it sounds impossible, but anyway, the warhead skipped on the water and skipped over our fantail and exploded on the other side. It was just by the grace of God that we weren't hit by the thing.
During a single 2-day period, the Japanese sent 350 kamikazes against the American fleet. Almost all were shot down, but a few did get through to do extensive damage to 19 ships, including the Pearl Harbor veteran battleship USS Nevada.
And it hit the side of the number 3 turret and blew up. And it blew the quarterdeck down right to the top of the table in the chief's quarters. And there were 45 injured and there were 11 killed.
You could look out over the bay there where we'd landed ships, and we could see those kamikazes coming in, and the amount of bullets we put up there, and they'd somehow managed to fly through that. And you're only seeing every third bullet, the tracers. You realize that there's that many, 3 times that more going up there. How could they fly through it? Well, they didn't always, but they did some. They got through there. And we had a grandstand seat, you might say.
Amidst this chaos, the Imperial fleet launched one last grand sortie, a suicide mission codenamed Operation Tengo that would commit much of Japan's remaining surface strength.
Once the Americans invaded Okinawa, the Japanese Navy, which really had for all intents and purposes been deactivated, tried one last desperate sortie, and this was the suicide mission of the super battleship Yamato. With just enough fuel and supplies to get them to Okinawa, the idea was to sail the Yamato down to the Japanese garrison in Okinawa, beach the ship, and then use its extremely large 18-inch guns to fire on the American troops and ships invading the island. Well, they didn't get far, obviously. As they sortied out of Japan, they were spotted en route by American reconnaissance aircraft, and that brought the full fury of American naval aviation down on the Yamato and her escorting cruiser and destroyers.
I think at one time there they figured there was 400 airplanes in the air off of these carriers. They had torpedo bombers and all the fighters and everything else. And so pretty soon somebody tally-hoes it, and whoever was one of the senior air group commanders was told that he was in charge, and he said, he just came out, attack at will. And so they were, and it was a wild scene. There were bombers coming in from all directions, torpedo planes down on the water, making low runs from all different sides.
Some of the guys dropped and made a radical turn. Some of them dropped and went directly over the top. It's hard to say which is the best way to do, but if you try to get out of there as quick as possible by turning, well, you just put up a big target, or you go right straight over it. It seems like a good way to go, except that they can train their guns all the way along.
I think they spent 4 or 5 hours working it over. I think it took 18 torpedoes to sink that battleship. And they sunk the cruiser, and I think 2 destroyers got away.
By the time I got out of the range of the anti-aircraft, my gunner said, "There she goes." And there the Yamato rolled over, and I was turning at the time, and I could see the bottom of the Yamato. And pretty soon there was a tremendous explosion, and the flame and the smoke into the clouds. And within, it seemed like just minutes, there was nothing left. It was gone.
The destruction of Yamato brought to a close the circle that had begun with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The formidable Imperial fleet that had delivered that stunning blow represented the epitome of Japanese naval engineering and embodied Japan's determination to defend its interests against the United States. 3.5 years later, little remained of the fleet that had once dominated the Pacific, a metaphor for the end of Japan's dream of empire. And even though the Americans had fought their last battle against an operational surface fleet, the Japanese were not yet finished. Okinawa, the last campaign fought by U.S. forces during the long and bloody Pacific War, would also turn out to be the costliest.
Okinawa was, in many ways, a European-style battle fought in the Pacific because Okinawa was so big. It was multi-divisional, even multi-corps. And the Japanese fought their hardest fought battle, down to the level of the wife sitting in her kitchen with a sharpened bamboo stake saying, "Come and get me." It was the blueprint for the defense of Japan. If there were any illusions whatsoever as to how the Japanese were going to react to an invasion of their home islands, it's right in front of you. Okinawa.
As the Americans struggled to gain the upper hand on Okinawa, kamikaze attacks on the fleet covering the troops ashore struck numerous capital ships, including the battleship New Mexico and the fleet carriers Enterprise and Hancock.
When our Hancock was kamikaze, I was out on an attack, but when I came back, we had to circle until they put a makeshift area for a deck, which is about a third as big as what the normal landing area was ordinarily. Some of the guys ran out of fuel because of the delay, and I landed, and I remember they took the plane immediately down, and when they looked there was a guy laying over his 40mm guns with all of his clothing blown off, and he was laying there dead. And there were guys blown up against the bulkheads with nothing on their clothes left, just blood, and it's just not a very pretty picture.
In spite of the terrible damage inflicted upon the American fleet off Okinawa, withdrawal was not an option. The support of operations on shore demanded continued fleet support. In this amazing sequence, a Japanese Zero begins a run on the battleship Missouri, operating off Okinawa on the 11th of April, 1945. The plane hit the ship's side below the main deck, but caused only minor damage when the bomb it was carrying failed to detonate. Miraculously, there were no casualties on board the Missouri, which steamed on as if nothing at all had happened. Most ships were not so fortunate. On May 11th, Admiral Mark Mitcher's flagship, the carrier Bunker Hill, was severely damaged by 2 kamikazes. The explosions that followed resulted in the deaths of 346 men.
Just a loud bang, and then of course after that there were many other noises and explosions and roaring and so on, but that was the first thing I heard. And I went up to our battle station at that time was in the wardroom, so I went up there and it was just chaos, smoke and stuff everywhere, because the kamikaze, the first one, the main one, hit right at the base of the island structure on the flight deck, right opposite, right in the middle of the dead center of the ship. And of course the ready rooms hang under the flight deck right there. And this guy went right through the torpedo squadron ready room and killed everybody that was in the ready room except for one guy.
To further combat the kamikazes, the fleet carriers moved north and struck at Japanese air bases in southern Kyushu.
We'd leave the Yorktown and fly low in the water, and when we approached Japan, we'd climb up a couple thousand feet and try to find our designated target, and we'd drop a couple bombs and climb up again. We were supposed to look and see if there were any kamikaze planes on the ground that we couldn't see from above, and so if we did see some planes, the next run we'd drop the other bombs on the planes that we might have seen in the airfield.
one of the airfields, I've forgotten the name of it, but I was making a run on it. Found a big double revetment, just like a double U. It had a zero parked in either revetment. And I came down at about a 60-degree angle, and I fired 2 rockets, one off each wing. And about halfway down, these were 5-inch rockets, and they crossed, and one went into each revetment, destroyed 2 zeros just like that.
Hundreds of kamikaze planes were destroyed on the ground during these attacks, much to the relief of the sailors off Okinawa. By the time the Japanese had expended the last of their kamikazes, they had sunk 36 ships, damaged 368, and inflicted nearly 10,000 casualties, including 4,900 killed, in exchange for some 5,000 pilots and planes.
When the war ended, the Americans discovered that the Japanese had stockpiled thousands of aircraft, pilots, and fuel for them, all hidden away, with the intention of making the American invasion fleet pay a higher price than they had off Okinawa.
Despite the incredible sacrifice and bravery of the Special Attack Corps, the kamikaze menace never threatened to defeat the Allied navies. The inexperience of the average kamikaze pilot made it easier for eager Hellcat and Corsair pilots, who shot these all but helpless men down in droves.
Really hazard was if you happen to be on the tail of a Japanese kamikaze and you followed it in to the ship where he was going, and you probably get shot down by our own fire, because it was so intense, and they couldn't. You just had to fly through it. So you were. They said if you want a Navy Cross, follow one in. You notice I didn't tell you I had the Navy Cross.
Out of the cloud came a Marine aviator in an F-4U Corsair, and it came down on the tail of this Japanese plane and shot it down just before it hit us. And of course, all of this, I was in the radar room, so I just saw pips, but on the screen, blips. But those on deck said the guy shot it down, and he pulled out of the dive and waved at us, and everybody waved back, you know, and everybody thought, well, there goes our hero.
Anti-aircraft fire also claimed hundreds of kamikazes.
Generally, to keep out of the fire of the destroyers, they would come in right on the water. I'm talking about maybe 8 or 10 feet above the water. And when they got to the destroyer, they'd pull up real abruptly and hope that they didn't get hit with the destroyer's weapons, and then they would just swoop down into a carrier. Just do a big kind of a loop into them. But they had us pretty well worried, because those people didn't care about life. They would just dive, and they'd dive right into the carrier.
By 1945, the American fleet had so many air defense systems that it was probably the single most formidable target any aviator has ever had to attack. To pierce the fleet's anti-aircraft defenses, the kamikazes first had to run the gauntlet of rapid-fire, heavy 5-inch flak while still over a mile from their target. Those who survived that fusillade faced hundreds of 40mm Bofors that could stud the sky with thousands of explosive shells. The few who survived to make their final attack runs encountered a storm of 20mm and 50 caliber machine gun fire.
When the 5-inch guns went off, we knew that we were being attacked. They were shooting pretty well out. And then when the 40mm started to go, you know that somebody's making a run on you. And then when the 20s went off and they're all going at the same time, then you know you're going to get it. You know, that's when you start looking for a rivet to hide under or something, anything. You know, it's hard to hide on a ship.
Those kamikazes lucky enough to penetrate the fighter screen and anti-aircraft guns often did not have the experience needed to guide their plane at high speeds into a ship. Consequently, there were many kamikazes that managed to survive the American combat air patrol screen and anti-aircraft fire, only to crash uselessly into the ocean.
These huge 20mm traces started coming up And right behind the tracers came this Zero. I guess his training was so minimal that he luckily couldn't even hit the carrier. But anyway, it exploded on the starboard side. Must have had a pretty good sized bomb because it really gave the ship a big jolt.
Though only a small percentage of kamikazes managed to reach their targets, the nature of the attacks inspired dread amongst American sailors. Those that got through to hit a ship almost always inflicted tremendous damage and casualties, making them one of the most feared and destructive weapons the U.S. Navy faced during the Second World War.
It's exciting, frightening, and the results can be pretty horrible.
And when they hit you, you know, there's nothing you can do. You got to stop them before they hit you. And so you just praying and hoping that you make it.
You wonder who's going to get lucky here. Are we going to knock this one or that next plane out of the air, or is he going to knock us out of the water? It's an eternal gamble.
Japan's last desperate gamble ultimately failed, but the deliberate sacrifice of a relative few allowed a weak military power to inflict serious damage on a far stronger opponent. After the fall of Okinawa in July 1945, Task Force 38 sortied from Leyte Gulf, seeking to neutralize Japan's remaining military strength prior to the invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for that November. Commanded again by Admiral Halsey, 3rd Fleet now included 10 Essex-class carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 battleships, 19 cruisers, and more than 60 destroyers. Beginning in mid-July, transportation networks, industrial plants, and base facilities were subjected to a series of punishing strikes.
The most important of these targets was Kure Harbor, where the last surviving major fleet assets available to the Japanese were sitting at anchor. And especially in July, the raids in July did tremendous damage to the surviving Japanese aircraft carriers, the Katsurugai, the Amagi, the Japanese battleships Ise, Hyuga, Tone. Some of these Japanese ships had illustrious histories, and they came to ignominious ends in the mud at Kure Harbor.
By the end of July, Japan's surface fleet and air arm had been virtually obliterated, much of her wartime infrastructure ruined, and most of her cities burnt out. And then, mercifully, the war came to an end. On August 15th, Admiral Halsey received orders to cease all offensive operations against Japan. Atom bombs, submarines, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, and the rampaging carriers offshore finally convinced the Japanese that they had run out of options. 2 weeks later, on September 2nd, 1945, the surrender was formally accepted aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Overhead, the Big Blue Blanket exercised its strength for one final time. The American Fast Carrier Task Force played a decisive role in the prosecution of the war in the Pacific, owing to a variety of factors that, taken together, provided an overwhelming edge. The tremendous output of American industry by 1943 allowed new ships and planes to reach the fleet at an incredible rate, and the Navy's training programs ensured that there were thousands of well-trained airmen and specialists available to man them. Wartime refinements to logistics allowed carrier task forces to remain at sea for months at a time, and provided the mobility needed to take and maintain the strategic initiative in the drive across the Central Pacific. The fast carriers made a mockery of Japan's perimeter defense strategy and carried the fight straight to the Japanese homeland, smashing all resistance in their path.
In retrospect, the greatest American military achievement of World War II was the creation of the Fast Carrier Task Forces, which later formed the basis of American foreign policy and crisis response for generations to come. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the last of the fast carriers built during World War II was finally taken out of service.
Originally developed during World War I to fulfill scouting duties for the battle fleet, the carrier's role took shape by trial and error and by the changing necessities of their age. By 1944, the carrier had supplanted the battleships as the Navy's most dominant weapon. Today, the carrier and her battle group can provide an immediate, flexible, and potent response to regional crises